British police. He was very involved in the military and in the Secret Service in Israel, and Israel military industries. But yesterday was the Hebrew calendar of the anniversary of the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin as well. So lots of important dates.
So I'm going to turn this over to Mike. I'm going to turn off my camera, and Hannah's going to turn off hers. And I'll see you after the beautiful lecture that we're going to hear, presentation.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Rabbi, just remind people before you turn off, leave the questions for the end, correct?
Correct. Leave the questions for the end.
So before I start, I want to take about 30 seconds to review last week's presentation, which was from the origins of Zionism to 1948. I say that facetiously because I cannot possibly in 30 seconds gloss over what I did in about an hour and a quarter. But in short, the idea of Zionism is something that Jews for millennia have longed to return to the land of Israel. But political Zionism formally starts in 1897 with the first Zionist Congress with Theodor Herzl convenes in Basel, Switzerland. But for 35 years before that, there have already been some ideological precursors to the Zionist movement. In 1880, the first wave of Aliyah begins, settling agricultural villages like Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov and Petach Tikva. 1904, a second wave of Aliyah, the Chalutzim, of immigration. The pioneers come and settle the socialist communities of the kibbutz and the moshav. And that period, 1904 to 1914, was really the foundational period of the Jewish community in Palestine. Not to say that there weren't people here, as I said, already from 1880, but that was really the Mayflower generation of Israelis, 1904 to 1914, subsequent waves of immigration of different character, and the building up of the Jewish community from late 19th to early 20th century, so that by the time the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, we'll see the map in a few minutes again to review, there already were 600,000 Jews living in Palestine, and pretty much everything that one needed for a society and a state, from a series of self-defense organizations to political parties, to educational system, to HMOs, to a philharmonic, to you name it, it was all in place here by 1947. So that's kind of what I talked about last week. And this week, I'm going to focus on our second part from the first almost 20 years of Israeli history. I think nothing short of miraculous. And oftentimes we look over this period because, 48 was big, the War of Independence, 67 was enormous, but there was another war in the middle there, 1956, Suez Crisis. There was a lot going on, the challenge of immigrant absorption, the economic challenge that the society faced, threats to the stability of society through immigration and through issues of separations from Germany. We will see in the next hour or so. Again, a screenshot of the Tel Aviv skyline. I always put this up there in all of my successions because I want to remind people of how far Israel has come as we kind of go through this, really 1862 to the present. So it's 150 years period.
Yeah. Mike, just talk a little slower. Little slower. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to review 180 years and 30 seconds, but I didn't. The immigration on the left-hand side of Jews from Yemen, of course, is one of the most important pieces of this 20-year period. And the heroic picture of the three paratroopers just standing in awe under the Western Wall in June of 1967 will be the two bookends, really, of this session. As I said, second part, the miraculous and challenging first 2 decades, begins with David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May, our first prime minister declaring independence there in what is now Independence Hall, what back then was the Tel Aviv Art Museum. Today it's moved. And there's actually, thanks to your fellow Los Angelinos, the new Amir wing of the Tel Aviv Art Museum, not too far from there. But here he is under a portrait of Theodor Herzl declaring Israeli independence on the 14th of May, Friday afternoon, 1948. The War of Independence was characterized, as I think I mentioned yesterday, first by civil war between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine until the last British soldier left at midnight, May 14th, May 15th of 1948. And here you can see, again, just don't look at the numbers, just look at the arrows. All of the invading forces from Lebanon in the north and Syria, Jordan, force of Iraqi soldiers, you can see coming up across just south of the Sea of Galilee, Egyptian soldiers, Palestinian Arabs as well. Massive onslaught the moment Israel declared independence on the 14th of May. The war continues until the spring of 1949, and we call this the War of Independence. However, you might have heard in recent years, many people in the world, and of course the Palestinians, refer to this as the Nakba, or the tragedy. And what's fascinating is that when I went to school in the 1970s, I went to a Jewish day school. I grew up, by the way, those who haven't met me, hi Mike. I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, made Aliyah 33 years ago, married to Michelle, an American. We have 3 Israeli-born kids, 28, almost 9, 26, and a 23-year-old. The youngest is still doing his 4-year military service in the Air Force. But when they all went to school in Israel, they all learned the term Nakba. I didn't, and I'm sure most of you had never heard the term until not that long ago. And I think that's telling about where Israel feels, telling its own story today, its own narrative. But the story of the beginning of refugees, 750,000 Palestinian refugees, combination of fleeing because there was a war going on, people being told to leave by their Arab leadership so they could have more space, the Arab forces, to defeat the nascent Jewish state, and of course, a number of instances where Israeli forces forcibly evicted Arabs. And the first time this was really mentioned publicly was by a man named Yitzhak Rabin, when he wrote his first biography in the 1970s, describing how he was given an order by Ben-Gurion to forcibly evict Arabs in Lod Ramla, about 5 miles away from where I'm talking to you from my home in Modi'in. So we call it the War of Independence. Palestinian Arab world calls it the Nakba. We're going to stick with War of Independence because this is a Jewish crowd, but I just want you to be aware of that terminology as well. Going back, as I said, 6 months, reviewing a little bit from last week, here is the map of 1947's United Nations Partition Plan. Now, it passed by significant vote, and the idea was largely to create 3 entities. Well, the idea was to create 3 entities, I should say, largely based on a number of criteria, including who lived where, probably more than anything else. And so this funny shaped map of the mandate that Britain received and was given officially in 1922 by the League of Nations was divided between these 3 light blue areas, supposed to be a Jewish state. The orange was supposed to be an Arab state. And this area here, Jerusalem and adjacent Bethlehem, was supposed to be a state that was going which is going to be an international zone accessible to everyone. Now, that was the plan. And in 1947, when the UN passed this, there was euphoria. And I, believe it or not, still guide people, and I was guiding up to March of last year, who say they were little children, and I'll never forget the moment they listened to the radio and that vote at Lake Success on Long Island when the UN voted to partition Palestine. Some of you might even remember that moment. Euphoria in the Jewish world, the borders weren't terribly viable. We didn't have access to Jerusalem, but better than nothing. 2.5 years after the end of the Second World War and the real discovery of the enormity of the catastrophe of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, we'll take it. The Arabs rejected, not only the Arabs in Palestine, I use the term under the British mandate, but all the Arab countries around. And so when we declared independence, our leader, Ben-Gurion, did not mention Jerusalem, and he didn't mention the borders. Look what happens at the end of the war. By the spring of 1949, here is the map, and it's a bit hard to see. Can you see where I'm drawing with my red cursor? This is the pre-60, this is the border. Everything here is called the West Bank, was annexed by Jordan. This area over here, Gaza, was taken over by Egypt. No Palestinian state, no state for the Arabs living between the Mediterranean Sea here and the Jordan River over there. And you'll see what I put these 3 little green arrows here to show you where the so-called green line is located. The green line is a term because on the map, you can't see from my presentation, it's too small, but on the map, they actually used a green crayon, I believe, to draw the line where the cessation of hostilities found different forces, Israeli, Jordanian, Egyptian, Syrian, whatever, in 1949. And ultimately, no Arab state was created, no international zone of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a divided city, you'll see in a minute. Jordan annexes illegally the West Bank. Egypt illegally takes over Gaza, and there is no fulfillment of that United Nations resolution because only one side accepted it. And the Palestinians were denied by their own brother state. In the meantime, during this fighting, both in the period leading up to independence and once Israel became independent, there was this civil war, and there were multiple Jewish forces. Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, decided 12 days after independence, that he was to make a united military force called the Israel Defense Forces, made up of a number of organizations, the biggest being the Haganah. The second biggest was the Palmach, the elite force, separate from the Haganah. Those are both kind of center-left politically. The Etzel, or Gun Tzva Leumi, the national army, affiliated with Menachem Begin to the political right, and Lochamei Cherut Israel, the Lechi, affiliated at that point with Yitzhak Shamir. And it's interesting because already in 1907 and 1909 and 1920, different underground organizations had started. There were different British forces, the Zion Mule Corps and the Jewish Brigade in the First World War. And so the Irgun and the Stern Gang and Palmach didn't like the idea of being under a unified leadership. Now, keep in mind, we hadn't yet had elections in Israel. We were born in the midst of a civil war, while the British were there. When the British leave in the middle of May of 48, it's a full-fledged war with foreign armies attacking. And the government is this provisional government, which is made up of representatives from the various Zionist organizations that had been around since the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And different groups, because of their political affiliations, did not want to unify under one command. And it's interesting, both from the right, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, didn't want to be part of a united force, nor did the Palmach, which is part of the political left. They didn't want to give up control. But Ben-Gurion said, we must, in order to proceed in the war, unify our forces. Ultimately, they disbanded. You can see the symbol over here of the Haganah. You can see, and by the way, you'll notice the symbol of the sword and the olive branch, right? We have a sword to defend ourselves. The olive branch is there so that we can reach out in peace to our neighbors. The symbol of the Palmach, the strike force, the kind of elite force that people like Yitzhak Rabin, Yigal Allon were a part of, with the sheaths of wheat, because they were living on kibbutzim and they were farmers and soldiers. The Etzel, to the political right, led by Menachem Begin, with the slogan, Rak Kach, only thus, and you'll notice the rifle in the middle, and the map showing historic Palestine on the left, and on the right-hand side, Transjordan. Politically, ideologically, they believe that both sides of the Jordan should be the Jewish state, and you can see what happens when they decide on the insignia of Tzahal, of the Israel Defense Forces. What symbol have they taken? Pretty much copied the Haganah, the biggest of the defense forces pre-48, with the Magen David, with the Star of David, and as I said, that is still the symbol of Tzahal, of IDF, as we speak. Now, they didn't come to the table very quietly. As I said, the Palmach to the left and the Etzel, or the Irgun, to the right, were very unhappy with having to fold and give up their authority to Ben-Gurion. And so during the War of Independence, less than a month after that declaration, on the 9th of June, the Irgun, Menachem Begin-led organization, sends a ship named the Altalena, which is a nom de guerre of the founder of revisionist Zionism, Jabotinsky. There were almost 1,000 volunteers and lots of weapons on it. And Ben-Gurion said, listen, we want that boat to be part of the leadership, right? The 26th of May, we've unified everyone under the IDF. You have to deliver that to the central command of the IDF. But Menachem Begin said, absolutely not. After first landing in a place just north of Tel Aviv, it went south. There was a military, literally off the shore of Tel Aviv, there was a military confrontation in full public view, and it was Yitzhak Rabin, who was the commander in Tel Aviv, who ordered Israeli Jewish soldiers to fire on Israeli Jewish soldiers. 16 members of the Etzel were killed, and 3 IDF soldiers were killed. Here you can see the boat burning. The weapons were lost, of course, burning literally off the shore of Tel Aviv, about where today's Hilton Hotel is. Crazy story. But many people would say that this prevented a civil war. And listen to what Ben-Gurion said. This was an attempt, his interpretation, it was an attempt to destroy the army and to kill the state. If the army and state surrendered to an independent force, the government might just as well pack up and go home. All of us want to avoid bloodshed, but there is no room for negotiations. They must turn over the ship to the government and accept the authority of the army. It is our army. If they do so, there will be no battle. If the affair is really over, there will be an amnesty, but there is no room for compromise or negotiations. The future of the war is at stake. He meant the future of the war with the Arab forces. Menachem Begin went on the radio that night, and he publicly declared the leader of the Exiles, who had been on the ship actually, and was rescued and managed to get out before the shooting started, and said, Jew will not fire against fellow Jew. And this story, the Altalena, is a trauma that continues to scar many sectors, particularly on the political right, in Israeli society, even 73 years later. And you'll oftentimes hear people say, remember how we were treated in the Altalena? Wasn't good blood, to say the least, spilt between Jew and Jew back then in 1948, in 3 weeks after Israeli independence. But as I said, some would argue that that ultimately ensured that there was unity in terms of the military defense in 1948. Already, while there is still a war, there's no ceasefire, there are elections, the 25th of January, with a huge turnout, if only 86.9 Americans or Israelis, we're pretty close, we get over 70%, would turn out for an election. That would probably be better for our societies. There is Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Israeli Workers' Party, socialist, or the Labor Party to the left. There actually is an Arab party, the Palestine Arab League. And here you can see the result. People vote not for candidates in Israel, but they vote for a party. And it was Ben-Gurion's party that received not quite 50%, 120 seats altogether in the parliament. And Ben-Gurion's party received 45. For you math experts, 60 is 50%. So what? 40% of the votes. He couldn't form a government. You need 61 minimally in a parliament of 120. So he had to form a coalition of religious parties, even an Arab party, the Democratic List of Nazareth, some Sephardic parties. And ultimately, you'll see a picture of the first cabinet. There is Ben-Gurion, the edge. There is the man who is the foreign minister, and the second prime minister, Moshe Sharet, will meet soon again. And there you all recognize, with her handbag on the floor, Golda Meirson from Belarusia via Milwaukee, the first foreign minister in Israel. So we have declared independence. We have our first elections, but we still have not ended the actual war. And so what do we have here? We have a picture of the negotiations. In Jerusalem here, there on the right is the Israeli team. That is Moshe Dayan, you might recognize. And on the left is the Arab Legion, the Jordanian Legion, led by Abdallah Tal. And on the right-hand side, you see the delegation to Rhodes, including Yigal Yadin and the late Yitzhak Rabin, who was, I think, a colonel, if I'm not mistaken, no, actually a major here by his insignia. They went to Rhodes, and ultimately, only in July of 1949 were the armistices signed between Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria. And the ones with Lebanon and Syria and Egypt, so there's Egypt down here, there's Lebanon up there, and there's Syria over here, were largely the same lines that were agreed upon between the British and the French in 1906, in one case with Egypt, and in the 19-teens and early 20s with France up in the northern part. But look at this funny colored map. I put this map here, I found it online, because it shows you the areas that fell under Arab control. The green area here is what is referred to as the West Bank, and this green area here is called Gaza. But the pink, including the city of Jaffa, part of Tel Aviv today, and this area here where the cities of Ashkelon and Ashdod are, the Galilee, and all this pink around here was all supposed to be part of the Arab state according to the Partition Plan. Look, here, this is the cessation of hostility agreement in 49. All of this kind of yellow was, or whatever you want to call it, orange, this color over here was the Jewish state. Gaza, much smaller than this area that was supposed to be part of an Arab state, and the West Bank smaller than what was supposed to be the Arab state, and the Galilee here ends up being part of a Jewish state. So the map looks very different from the Partition Plan. And again, once in a while we hear, why don't we go back to the Partition Plan of 1947? It wasn't accepted in 47, it wasn't accepted in 49, and as I mentioned before, illegally, against the United Nations recommendation, Jordan took over the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and annexed it. Israel, by the way, is not annexed the West Bank. It's annexed East Jerusalem. It annexed the Golan Heights in 1980, but it did not annex the West Bank. Annexation has different legal ramifications. And Gaza, Egypt occupied it in late 70s, early 80s, when Israel and Egypt signed the peace agreement. Egypt said, thank you, but no thank you. We do not want the Gaza Strip and the refugees there. So the most important part, I think, of the map was the division of Jerusalem. The good news, let me go back a step here, was that if you can see the pink, remember, the pink was supposed to be an Arab state, and the green. And the light blue was supposed to be the Jewish state. And if you look at the map, if you lived in Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem, that was pink over here, was supposed to be internationalized. According to the UN Partition Plan, the only way to go from Tel Aviv here to Jerusalem would be through an Arab state. It's like going from West Germany to Berlin from 1945 until 1989. You had to go through this corridor. And what happens here, you'll notice, Jerusalem is accessible from all of the Jewish state of Israel, except not perhaps the most important part of it, the Old City. That was part of Jordan. There was one crossing point, not for Israelis to go to Jordan or vice versa, but for clergy to go from one side to the other, diplomats to go. And here you can see that famous Mandelbaum gate. It literally was the front porch of a house owned by the Mandelbaum family. I don't know, not the Manischewitz and not the Mandelblit or whatever, but the Mandelbaum family. And here was this crossing point between, you can see in French and in English, Spanish, between Israel and Jordan. Another version, you can see the nuns coming from one side to the other. And the building is still there, by the way. It's on the side of a major artery in Jerusalem today. I think it's yeshiva in that building, but this was the Mandelbaum Gate, 1949 until 1967. And a lot of people don't remember the fact that, you know, Berlin kind of had all the fame, and when they put up the wall in 61, it was even more famous. But this was a divided city for that 19-year period. And I put up two maps, the first of which now, you'll see different colors. All what is darker blue was Israel. So to the left of the map is west, right? This is east to the right. And everything in this red line over there was under Jordanian rule. Everything, sorry, all the light blue, I should say, was Jordanian. And everything in this reddish line here, including the Old City, was the Jordanian municipality of Jerusalem. Everything within the yellow line over here was Israeli Jerusalem. Israeli Jerusalem, Jordanian Jerusalem. Our side much bigger than their side, but you couldn't go from the Knesset, the parliament, to the Old City, to the Western Wall. And just to the north, and just to the east, and just to the south of Jerusalem was Jordan. And there was a very palpable fear from 48 to 67 that this could be cut off very easily, and all of Jerusalem would be lost. Another image of how the city changed after 67. The blue here is what was Israeli controlled, 48 to 67. The brown was Jordanian. And post 67 war, what does Israel do? It annexes all of Arab Jordanian Jerusalem and expands the city to the north and to the south. Today, it is the biggest city in the country with close to 1 million, believe it or not, 950,000 residents, about 2/3 Jewish and about 1/3 Arab. I don't know if any of you, and maybe in the question and answer period, you can tell me if so, I'd be fascinated to hear. If you were in Jerusalem up until 1967, from 48 to 67. But if you did, you would have this view of the Old City. There's the Old City Wall, the Tower of David, the Jaffa Gate, and this area, which is today a very nice shopping arcade called the Mamilla Mall, was in ruins. It was literally no man's land between Jordanian-held Jerusalem and Israeli Jerusalem over here. You can see the kids playing in their fences. There's a little sign over there that says danger frontier ahead. And this was what is today the most expensive real estate in town. The Waldorf Astoria just opened there. The David Citadel Hotel is there. Very neglected area in those 19 years because nobody wanted to live next to the frontier. Risk being exposed to Jordanian soldiers who were up on the walls of the Old City. Here, for example, is the street, King David Street, where the Hebrew Union College is located, where many of your rabbis and cantors probably spent their first year of studies, in the YMCA up over there. And look at this picture of 1949 to 1967. Same round building over here is this building, is this building back over there. You can see the YMCA. Barrels, warning people, there's no five-star hotel called the David Citadel on the corner. There's no man's land there. Don't turn the corner. Because if you do, a Jordanian soldier might see you and they might say, now is my opportunity to kill someone on the other side. 1949 to 1967. One of my major sources for putting this presentation together was a book by an Israeli journalist, Nisa Mishal, Sephardic origin, called Those Were the Years. And in the first 25 years, in his introduction, he describes it as follows. This is the first decade even. The first decade was dominated by values of togetherness. Those were the years of collective being, of absorbing immigrants and settling the land, and of making the desert flourish and of building the IDF. We were friends and brothers in arms. We settled for less and remained humble. Our parents spoke the tongue of historic longing, Hebrew, and national goals and big solutions, around which the masses rallied with vast and sweeping public support. There really was this sense of togetherness and of national purpose. That was a time when individual hardships were suppressed in favor of overall feelings of being under siege and the constant need for individual sacrifice. Israel was ruled by the social values of the settlers. We talked about that last week, those who came late 19th, early 20th century. It's the team more important than the individual. That's very important because I think, at least in recent decades, Israel has become much more of an individualist society, moving from the we to the I or the me. Whereas in the early years, it really was a we society. The Sabra, the mythological figure who I showed you last week, boyish and romantic, veiled in dreams, feverishly in search of himself, seeking self-fulfillment in the collective. That line, I think, to me was so powerful, seeking self-fulfillment in the collective. In other words, my role as an individual is to find my place in the collective rather than the other way around. And I think that's indicative in general of the foundational myth of the socialization of the first generations of Israelis, in contrast very much to the American model of the individual and the liberties that we have. It's a very, very different model. I'm not going to say good or bad. It's different, to say the least. The biggest challenge that Israel had in these years was what we call in Hebrew kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. Now, this picture on the left-hand side you recognize. There's a personal connection. This man over here, Eli Adalis, Alav Shalom, my late uncle. He was a Holocaust survivor from Poland. He came to Palestine, the only one in his family to survive, lived on a kibbutz, and then moved to Canada where he met my aunt. They married, had 3 kids. He passed away in the 70s, Eli, but his 3 children, I have a Chabad cousin who's early 60s, and I think he's got like 18 grandchildren. So this one man, Eli, probably is about 25 to 30 different descendants already in a couple generations. And there were hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors who came to the country. In fact, the population I mentioned earlier was 600,000 at the beginning of Israeli independence. Within 3 years, the number doubled. Why? Imagine a country with 600,000 people in the midst of its first ever war, an almost civil war, in the midst of rationing food, in the midst of having elections, absorbs 100,000, 15% of its population. And next year, 250,000, another almost 200,000 the year after that. By 1953, almost 750,000 arrivals had come. By 1958, the 10th birthday of Israel, the population had trebled 1.8 million people, where about 500,000 from Europe, many Holocaust survivors, but an additional 750,000, almost the same number of the Arab refugees in 48, who were kicked out or encouraged to leave countries in which Jews had lived for not centuries, but millennia. Morocco, Yemen, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, etc., etc. And many of these immigrants from the Middle East we refer to as Sephardim, except it's a bit of a misnomer. The term actually in Israel is more Mizrahi, Easterner, than Sephardic, because Sephardim are people originate in Sfarad. Sfarad is the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. But we know, 1492, we were kicked out of Spain, 1497 out of Portugal. There weren't that many Jews in Spain. Many went to Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. But the term Mizrahi or Easterner is generally used to refer to immigrants to Israel from Middle Eastern countries, from the Maghreb, West Africa, Morocco, to Yemen, Iraq, and Iran. But here's the problem. Mizrahi is east. I don't know if you've looked at your map recently, but Poland and Lithuania are further east than Morocco. So it's a term, it's more of a sociological rather than a geographic term. But the difference, I think, between the immigrants, like this family from Yemen, walking sometimes for dozens or many more miles to get onto a bird with silver wings, which they read of in the Bible, they'd never seen an airplane in their life, and then to land in this Jewish homeland that they prayed to come back to, as I said last week, for 2.5 millennia, with nothing except the clothes literally on their backs. And here you see this transit camp in a place called Rosh Ain. Today it's famous. It's the home of Gal Gadot, Wonder Woman. It's the home of the defense minister, Benny Gantz, and many other famous Israelis right in the center of the country. This was a transit camp where literally hundreds of thousands of new immigrants came in this first decade from a very, very different world, from an Eastern world into more of a Western world. And I say that because, remember, the founding generation of Zionists were Jews who came from Eastern Europe, late 19th, early 20th century. And here you can see some pictures of the Yemenite, of some Yemenite Jewish, I don't know why, of some Yemenite Jewish immigrants in the tents shortly after they arrived. Not always happy, barefoot, really hot in the tents in the summer, really cold and wet in the tents in a very, very short winter, to say the least. And ultimately, these tents became transit camps, which were where caravans were essentially put, or prefab houses were put, which eventually were turned into public housing estates, which today, unfortunately, are still some of the more socioeconomic challenged neighborhoods in the country. Some of these pictures you might have been familiar with of the newcomers coming, not all from Yemen, I don't know where this could be from Morocco, but somewhere from the Middle East in that first decade. What were the big challenges faced by a country that had just buried 1% of its population in the War of Independence? 6,000 people were killed. A country that did not have enough food to feed a population that had trebled. And so, big issues. Not much being produced in this country, few exports, needed a lot of imports. The country had very little foreign currency. Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, established a ministry of rationing and supply to ration food and later on furniture. A lot of black market developed, particularly from amongst those who lived in the agricultural communities. And the period, I think, really ended with the reparations that were agreed upon with Germany in 1952. And finally, the austerity and the rationing was removed in 1959. But try to imagine a government with no foreign currency, not enough foreign currency, not enough food. How do you provide housing for a population that grew by 200% in the first decade? And as the rabbi said at the beginning, a couple of us were having a conversation, that it really still is a major scar within Israeli society over the treatment, or the mistreatment, I should say, of the immigrants from the Middle East by the founding fathers and mothers, who were the Ashkenazim, who came in the late 20th century. Picture in Haifa, people waiting in line. Here's a typical ration card from the month of June. It tells you how much rice here in Hebrew and how much coffee and jam and sugar and tea and milk chocolate and cocoa and butter and fats and eggs. And people had to go for the first almost decade of the country in order, with these ration cards, in order to get food. It's at this time that there's almost another civil war in Israel over reparations. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer declares in 1951 that unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity. And what happens is, reluctantly, Ben-Gurion enters into negotiations with what he called a different Germany. However, those on the political right, led by Menachem Begin, refused to accept German payment, which they saw as blood money. Well, we killed you, now we'll give you some money and we will atone for the murder. And there was a major rally, you'll see in my next slide a picture of Menachem Begin, tens of thousands of people in downtown Jerusalem, saying there will be a civil war until death. And quoting the biblical account of the story of King Ahab having one of his subjects killed because he was jealous over his vineyard, Naboth, And as the Bible, as Elijah the prophet rebukes the king Ahab 2,700 years ago, Heratzachta v'gam yarashta, have you killed and also taken possession? Seriously? You've killed our brothers and sisters, and now, anyway, the Knesset passed the resolution 61-50, but the protest became violent, rocks were thrown in the Knesset, and Ben Gurion actually was wounded in the Mali. And as I said, it's a complicated chapter in Israeli history. About 15% of Israel's gross domestic product in the first decade was from German reparations, both to individual survivors as well as to Israel as a country. And that is huge when you think about the economic challenges. It took another 13 years, by the way, until diplomatic relations were restored with Germany, were signed with Germany. And I would say, you might have seen in the papers, yesterday, German Air Force planes flew over Jerusalem, for the first time, by the way, since the First World War. And they flew together with Israeli airplanes. So you had F-15s and F-35s from Israel with German airplanes flying over Jerusalem as a symbol of the alliance between the two countries. Just last week, Angela Merkel, in her last weeks in office, came and paid a state visit as well. So Israel and Germany today have very, very close ties, but it wasn't always that way, and it wasn't always that easy. And here you see Menachem Begin in front of the rally, massive rally. Look at the huge number of people who literally, after he spoke, turned 180 degrees, walked up the hill, up what is today Ben Yehuda Street, to the Knesset, where the riots broke out. So almost setting off civil war. Ben Gurion was our first prime minister until 1953. Then he resigned, and the foreign minister, Moshe Sharet, there he is on the right, became prime minister. It only lasted 2 years. Ben Gurion was pulled out of retirement and came back in 1955. And it's interesting that the military, all of a sudden, goes through massive changes. Remember, almost civil war over the unification, or opposition to unification, I should say, of the undergrounds in 1948. But all of a sudden, Moshe Dayan, as the chief of staff, turns the IDF into an offensive army, not just the Israel defensive, but offensive. And we'll see that in a couple of minutes. There was another major issue, internal debate within Israel regarding the rescue or not, or the murder of Hungarian Jews. Huge trial over this man, Kastner, who was a government official with the Labor Party, who was on trial. He wasn't on trial, but there was a libel trial. Someone else had falsely accused him, he believed, of cooperating with the Nazis. And ultimately, the judge ruled in favor against this guy Kastner and said, yes, this guy Kastner used his contacts with the Germans to benefit his friends and family. Ultimately, though, what happened was, so Kastner lost his trial of libel, but shortly after the trial, he was killed, political murder. It took a couple years until the Supreme Court posthumously ruled in Kastner's favor. It's an amazing story. And by the way, his granddaughter is today the leader of the Labor Party in Israel. Merav Michaeli, she is our minister of, what is she? Not minister. She's the leader of the Minister of Transport. She is the leader of the Labor Party in Israel. And when she made her inaugural Knesset address a few years ago, she referred to the hatred and the animosity in society, going back to the murder of her grandfather, who she never met. Roy Rothenberg, in a community next to the Gaza Strip in April of 1956, the man in charge of security, who the day before this man, Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, had visited, is murdered by Egyptian soldiers. Don't read this paragraph. Don't read this at all. Moshe Dayan comes back the next day to eulogize Roy Rothenberg. And it's a very powerful moment in the early days of Israeli history. Listen briefly to his eulogy. Yesterday at dawn, Roy was murdered. The quiet of the spring morning blinded him, and he didn't see those who sought his life hiding behind the furrow. Let us not cast blame today on the murderers. What can we say against their terrible hatred of us? For 8 years now, since Israeli independence, they have sat in refugee camps of Gaza and have watched how before their very eyes we have turned their land and villages where they and their forefathers previously dwelled into our home. It is not amongst the Arabs of Gaza, but in our own midst that we must seek Roi's blood. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at our fate and see in all its brutality the fate of our generation? Let us today take stock of ourselves. We are a generation of settlement. Remember last week, for those who were here, I talked about the role of settlement as ultimately determining the borders of Israel. I talked about settlement in the contemporary context of the political hot potato of the settlements in the West Bank, the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. And without the steel helmet, this is the crucial part, and the gun's muzzle, we will not be able to plant a tree and build a house. Dayan, as the defense minister, recognized the importance of having to protect ourselves, at the same time spend resources protecting ourselves as we are farming the land. Let us not fear to look squarely at the hatred that consumes and fills the lives of hundreds of Arabs who live around us. Let us not drop our gaze, lest our arms weaken. That is the fate of our generation. That is our choice, to be ready and armed, tough and hard, or else the sword shall fall from our hands and their lives will be cut short. Very powerful. And I would argue 60, 70 almost years later, that is still the challenge that we have as we speak. 2 hours ago, I got a message from the Israeli website, a news site that says that the border areas are now open. There was a security alert along the border with Gaza. We have lived with the threat of Gaza and our neighbors, and that challenge that Israeli society has continues to be there. Over their hatred, as Diane said in 1956, over the fact that they perceive that event of that Nakba, the tragedy of us, in their eyes, usurping the land that was theirs, without, of course, going into a discussion whether we believe we have, which we do, a historic claim to. 1956, in October, there was this very bizarre operation called the Sinai Campaign, or Operation Kadesh, reminding you that in 1952, Egyptian revolution happens, and a group of soldiers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrow the monarchy of King Farouk. 4 years later, the leader of government, Gamal Abdel Nasser, decides to nationalize the Suez Canal, built by the French, partially owned by the British and the French. And ultimately what happens is the French and British convince Israel to launch this Operation Musketeer. Israel launches an attack. And by the way, it's the last time that paratroopers actually jumped. Both my boys have jumped from airplanes in training in the military, but they haven't jumped in action since 1956. Almost 200 Israeli soldiers were killed in barely a week. And what happened was the Soviet Union and the States exerted pressure and forced Israel to withdraw. In brackets, by the way, the uprising in Budapest was happening in the exact same time. And there was not the same outcry by the US, believe it or not, in the United Nations about that. But that's in a separate note. If any of you are of Hungarian background, a special United Nations force is set up to keep the peace between Egypt and Sinai in 1957. From Israel's point of view, it opened up the Straits of Tiran, the straits to which a lot of boats came to our southern port of Eilat, particularly bringing oil from Iran, and it stopped the attacks by Arab Egyptian terrorists from Sinai. It also, though, led to the creation of something called Fatah, a new terror organization which began to launch attacks in the north, not from the south in Egypt, but rather in the north. And in many ways, I think it marked the end of the British and French influence in the Middle East and the increased importance and ascendancy of Soviet support, and also, I think, beginning of American role in the Middle East. Here's some of the pictures. You see the paratroopers landing. You see some of the Israeli, French, by the way, airplanes back then. And here you can see Defense Minister Moshe Dayan decorating some of the paratroopers. It's a small chapter in Israeli history. I put the short video up here from the internet, from Movie Tone News. It might be a little bit nostalgia for some of you here. Take 2 minutes to hear the story of the oftentimes forgotten 1956.
The Suez Canal, storm center of controversy for weeks, now becomes a cause of war in a lightning sequence of diplomatic and military moves. Since its seizure and nationalization by President Nasser of Egypt, the vital waterway has precipitated a new crisis in the already tense Middle East. Crack French units are embarked at Marseille, bound for a joint staging area with Great Britain on Cyprus, less than an hour's flight from Egyptian ports, where they are prepared for seizure of the canal by force. Simultaneously, Britain reinforces its garrison on the island for the same eventuality. naval concentration in the eastern Mediterranean strengthens the military buildup, even as Israel, in a lightning attack, thrusts deep into Egypt to the vicinity of the canal. France and Britain issue a 12-hour ultimatum that all fighting must cease. Within hours of its expiration, Britain's warplanes are winging their way to Egypt, and its bombers attack 5 key cities, including Cairo. Following a Security Council veto by Britain and France of a United States motion for a ceasefire, President Eisenhower, after consultation with Secretary of State Dulles, makes a firm declaration of United States policy.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. I therefore have no plan to call the Congress in special session.
Arriving from the west to avoid frontal attacks on densely populated areas, Israeli forces from the Sinai Desert occupy the troubled Gaza Strip, taking early precautions that keep to a minimum incidents that could provoke bloodshed. A peaceful occupation that allows the native populace maximum freedom. Later, after a flight on a reconnaissance plane over the Sinai Peninsula, Movietone News visits with the Israeli troops, which defeated the Egyptians in this desert no man's land. Considered an act of self-preservation, the expedition results in the fall of the Egyptian fortress at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was firing on shipping bound for Israel. It yields thousands of prisoners to the victorious forces, with $40 million worth of battle equipment which Cairo recently received from Soviet Russia. Rating cheers for General Moshe Dayan, Israeli Commander-in-Chief.
So as I said, it's a oftentimes overlooked chapter in Israeli history. Fascinating. 1956, first of all, Movietone was there before CNN had embedded journalists. Remember, only in the Gulf War in 1990, but a little bit of nostalgia. And again, an oftentimes glossed over, even if you ask my kids about the Sinai Campaign, and my kids evolve in the military and they learn about wars, it's kind of not a major issue. But it was important, as I said, in many of the factors that I already outlined. In 1959, the tension between the Mizrahi/Sephardic immigrants and the Ashkenazi elite grew. And the first spark that ignited was in this neighborhood in Haifa called Wadi Salim. It had been abandoned largely by Arabs, and there were 15,000 immigrants, mostly from Morocco. What happened was the police shot and wounded a rowdy drunk named Yaakov El Karif. And the next day, local police station was attacked, protesting the shooting of this innocent man, as well as unemployment and harsh living conditions and poverty and ethnic discrimination and a lot of stuff. It quickly turned into race riots that spread in different areas of the country, including in the neighborhood in Jerusalem, which we'll visit in next week's time, I should say. Here you can see the protests, right? In many ways, it's a protest of the immigrant underclass toward or against the Ashkenazi elite. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants, as I said, come from with large families, lacking post-secondary education, not having financial resources, established Israeli society, sent them to these periphery and border communities, living in squalid conditions. And oftentimes the elite Ashkenazi would refer to them as the generation of the wilderness. In other words, like those in the desert who had to die off and only their children would come to the promised land, so too with these Mizrahi immigrants, or human dust, really a lot of tension between the Ashkenazi elite and the Mizrahim. And these riots really became the symbol of deprived sectors of society toward the establishment. There were other riots in 1971 in Jerusalem, and Golda Meir met the leaders of this group called the Black Panthers. We'll meet them next week, Charlie Biton and others. And she said, they aren't nice boys. Well, you're not going to get very far if you're not listening to the calls of huge sectors of Israeli society who very much feel that they've been mistreated by the elites. Ultimately, that sector in society gave Menachem Begin and the political right the votes he needed. And again, I'm going a couple weeks ahead of us to win the 1977 elections. Thereafter, Begin established something called Project Renewal. Many of you involved in Federation might be familiar with this, to gentrify and to fix up and invest in neighborhoods largely of Mizrahi immigrants. The next major event in Israel is the story of the Eichmann capture and the Eichmann trial. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main implementers of the Nazi final solution, to remind you, he appears in Budapest in the spring of 44 and ultimately is responsible for killing 437,000 Hungarian Jews in about an 8-week period. He's discovered in Argentina, living under a pseudonym, Ricardo Clement. The director of the Mossad, Issa Harel, says we've got to capture him and put him on trial. Not him, but put the Holocaust on trial in Jerusalem. And so they capture him, they fly him to Jerusalem, and the leader, the head of the Mossad, says it was hard to believe that this lowly creature was the same, quote, superhuman, Ubermensch, who had orchestrated the murder of the Jews. Why do it during this very difficult period in Israel? Why risk diplomatic relations with Argentina by essentially kidnapping someone? Quote, it was called upon to perform an act of supreme historic justice, to hold a public trial about the Holocaust. It wasn't an end, the capture of Eichmann, but merely a means. The end was the trial of the Holocaust. Israel's historic duty, Harel continued, to the Jewish nation. Had Israel avoided the duty, it wouldn't be worthy of its historical calling. Ultimately, he's put on trial. He's brought here, I should say. Ben-Gurion announces that Eichmann is incarcerated and his trial will begin. He never denied his identity, but insisted that he was merely a regular soldier following orders. Here you'll see the picture of him under police protection in Jerusalem. And I want to read for you the opening line of the prosecutor, Attorney Gideon Hausner. There's a school named after him, actually, I think in San Francisco. His chilling words. Very subjectively filled with many references. But when I stand before you here, judges of Israel, very biblical, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I'm not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger toward him who sits in the dock and cry, J'accuse. Emile Zola, 1896, the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, accusing the French military establishment of unnecessarily framing this innocent Jewish officer. For their ashes are piled on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka, and are strewn in the forests of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore, I will be their spokesman, and in their name, I will unfold the terrible indictment. Ultimately, under the law trying Nazis and their helpers, over 100 survivors testified. The first time people heard publicly, there was no TV then, there was live radio and newsreels would show in the cinemas, the testimony of Holocaust survivors. And he said, I'm guilty of being obedient of serving during wartime. I did not persecute Jews out of my own desire. The government did that. Ultimately, he was given a death sentence and he was killed on the 1st of June, 1942. Other major events following the Eichmann trial in the 1960s leading up to the Six-Day War. Ben-Gurion, after a second term, resigns. After 8 years, I think, Levi Eshkol becomes the prime minister and defense minister. In January of 64, the Palestine Liberation Organization is formed. And I put this here, quote, to carry out the role in liberating the homeland, Israel, and determining their destiny, and to attain the objective of liquidating Israel, establishing a Palestine Liberation Army. This is 1964. For those critics of Israel who say that that the occupation leads to violent response, well, the violent response is an occupation after the Six-Day War. We're not there yet, folks. This is occupation of Israel from 1948 to 1967. Remember this? Remember Roy Rothenberg's murder and Moshe Dayan's eulogy. Tension grows in the north over the national water carrier. Israeli spy Eli Cohen, if you didn't read the book My Man in Damascus, you probably saw that very good movie a couple of years ago, Spy, with Sacha Baron Cohen, and he's found and put on trial and executed on May 18th, 1965. In the right, you can see Shai Agnon, the Galicia-born Israeli who was the first and only, to date, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature with Nelly Sachs in 1966. That same year, Israel ends military occupation. For Arab Israelis, 1/5 of the population lived, I don't know if you know this, under a different set of laws military occupation until 1966. They were citizens. They could vote. They could even serve in the parliament, but there's strict limitations on them for the first 18 years of Israeli history. And in 1966, the Syrians and Egyptians signed a defense pact, which will lead us into our next week's session on the 1967 Six-Day War. Increased PLO incursions from the north. Israeli jets retaliated, and there were dogfights between Israel and the Syrians, actually, over those issues. The national water carrier, I'm not going to show this movie, I don't have time, built in the 1950s, completed in 64 to take water from the Sea of Galilee in underground canals, an overground canal and underground pipes, I should say, all the way down here to the Negev, which took billions of gallons of water from here about 50 kilometers and then another 130 kilometers, another 100, about 200, about 140 miles from where we had a lot of water to where we had a lot of space to grow food for the burgeoning Israeli society. And you can see this banknote, some of you might remember, from the 80s of the Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. And I put this banknote because it's right about this period. The national water carriers completed in 64. In 65 and 66, two major institutions, you'll see in my next slides, were opened in Jerusalem. And only in 67 was Jerusalem reunified. All of these things happened under Levi Eshkol. And you can see here, Prime Minister, from 63 to 68, there is the Knesset, there is the Israel Museum, here is the old city unified under his control, and there is our leader. But on the back, with the same amount of importance, perhaps, by the designer of the banknote, is the national water carrier. He was the guy in charge of the Minister of Infrastructure of this project that ultimately brought water and ensured the survival of food and water of this massive growing Israeli society in its first 20 years. And you can see here is the water from the Sea of Galilee in the pipe and the canals down to the now lush desert area of the Negev. I love this picture because the contrast between the things that happened, we're not going to see the movie, during the rule of Levi Eshkol. What have we next? Let there be water. Again, I can't stress, I do a whole hour and a half session on water in Israel, but the imagination and daring, and I quote from a book called Let There Be Water by Seth Siegel a few years ago, engineering innovation and a variety of financing vehicles ultimately led to transform the country, right? As I said, massive issues of immigration, not enough food. What's amazing, of course, is that the British in the 1930s said there's not enough space for any more Jewish immigration. We saw that last week. Why? They believed that with the water that is here, there was only enough water for 2 million people. Well, guess what? Today, there are 9.2, almost 3 million Israelis. There are 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. Together, that's 700% of what the upper limit the British thought that this land could hold in terms of its population, based on the water resources, right? Israel went from this country that could barely feed itself, was barely self-sufficient, became self-sufficient in agriculture, and exported billions of dollars of high-quality agricultural products every year. Think of the Jaffa oranges, maybe not in California so much, but if you come from the East Coast, definitely, or the Carmel tomatoes or flowers in Holland. Unfortunately, today we have less agricultural exports, more agricultural technology airports. But ultimately, Ben-Gurion was right. And he said, the worthless, barren desert turned out to be very productive and very valuable. I'm almost at the end. I'm about to turn to Q&A. Remember that banknote? I'll show it one more time here of Levi Eshkol. One side, the national water carrier. The other side over there, the three major things that happened in Jerusalem under his watch. One, is the opening of the Israel Museum and the Shrine of the Book in May of 65. There's the main part of the Israel Museum. And there is the Shrine of the Book with a black wall and the white dome reminiscent of the top of one of the ceramic jars in which the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. This opened in May of 1965. Here's the opening ceremony, I think, on the right-hand side. Another picture in a minute. But look at how sparse Jerusalem is. This is the area where Yad Vashem is opened up off there. This is all hills. These are all hills, that are today covered with neighborhoods as the city grew remarkably post-1967. There is the emptiness of the Israel Museum. You can see the Shrine of the Book on the right again. I love these pictures. And you can see the opening ceremony. There is Ben Gurion. He's hard to miss with his hair, you see. And over there, looking that way, some of you might remember Teddy Kollek, the Indefatigable. It's the only English word to describe him. Mayor of Jerusalem from 1965 until 1993. And one of the major things that he did was open the National Museum in Jerusalem, 65. Across the street from it is the Knesset, which was inaugurated in August of 1966. What does it say about a society that actually opens its national museum before it opens its home of national parliament? Pretty amazing to say the least. Here you can see, looking back toward Jerusalem, the other way from the Israel Museum, there is the opening ceremony. And of course, big thing, we even issued a postage stamp because, hey, we finally made it. We have a parliament. This is 65, this is 66. But at the same time, as these massive national celebratory events are happening, there is a growing tension in the spring of 67, which ultimately leads to the 67 war. And without having you all reread Michael Oren's 1967, 6 Days of War, which is an amazing book, I will give you in this one slide, literally a handful of lines with the major dates leading up to where we'll come back to next week, the 67 Six-Day War. In May, President Nasser, coup in 52, nationalization of the Suez Canal in 56, remember. In May of 67, he expels the United Nations force that had been in Sinai since 56, and Israel then called up the reservists. Now, in brackets, the Israel Defense Forces is made up largely of reserve soldiers. It used to be that way, in that most major wars/operations involved calling in the reservists because the minority of soldiers were 18 to 21. The majority of soldiers were those post their release up until their 50s. Today it's different because they're more 18 to 21-year-olds, just in terms of the number. We're 9.3 million Israelis today. And so I know from my son's military experience, yes, they do reserve duty, but it's a lot less reserve duty the older you get. In other words, my 28-year-old barely gets called. My 23-year-old, when he gets out in December, will probably be called a lot. He's in the Air Force Search and Rescue, and they do a lot of reserve duty. But most infantry soldiers might come back for a couple of weeks of training a year. Very different than what it used to be back then in the 60s. So we called in the reservists. But if hundreds of thousands of men between the age in their 20s to 50s have to wait for the war, you're basically bringing your economy to a standstill. So 2 days after the reservists are called in, Nasser does a second action. He closes the Straits of Tiran, cutting off shipping from Asia to Eilat, their southern port. Both of these are seen as Israel's acts of war casus belli, and there was this flurry of diplomatic activity to try to prevent war. Your president told Foreign Minister Abba Eban it would be, quote, unwise to, quote, jump the gun. And he told him 3 times that, quote, Israel will not be alone unless it decides to go alone. We cannot imagine that Israel will make this decision, as quoted by Martin Gilbert. Somebody asked me about Martin Gilbert last week. There you go. Proof that he's behind me on that bookshelf. The cabinet was divided what to do. Nasser, Egypt, and Syria, remember, a year before it signed a military pact. So it was these 2 countries together. What do? May 27th. We've already got the reservists waiting for this imminent attack. Another period of waiting continues within Israel, and more reservists are called. In the meantime, Jordan joins this Egyptian-Syrian military alliance by the end of May. So within 2 weeks, we've got hundreds of thousands of reservists called up. The American administration is saying, don't declare war, because you'll be in it on your own. And what do? The 3 countries around us are clearly mobilizing, and their public declarations are saying they're going to attack us. The government forms a national emergency unity government with Menachem Begin, the political right, head of the opposition, brought in, and Moshe Dayan replaces Levi Eshkol as the defense minister. There was a time, under Ben Gurion in particular, where the prime minister was also the defense minister. Levi Eshkol wasn't a military man. A lot of people saw them as this elder statesman without military experience. We need someone who knows what's going on. Look at Moshe Dayan. He's the guy. We want him back. And they did bring him back as defense minister. Within a matter of days, Israel decided to launch a preemptive military strike. At 7:45, all of its 200 airplanes, except for a dozen, were kept to protect Israeli airspace. Devastated, flattened, emaciated, eviscerated, eliminated, whatever term you want to use, the Egyptian Air Force, while the planes were mostly on the ground. Israel then warned King Hussein of Jordan, don't get involved. He said it was too late, the die has been cast. The Israel Air Force destroyed 374 Arab aircraft on the ground and many others in dogfight. And as a result, very quickly achieved aerial supremacy. Next week, we'll go more into the war. I'll leave you with this news flash from the Chicago Tribune, Monday, the 5th of June, 1967, Jews, Arabs, War. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I stop sharing my screen and I turn it over to you to ask the questions. Rabbi, and if you want to monitor them, if you want me to see what's going on there, please.
I just have one question.
Yes.
If you ever saw The Crown, which is, I know, fiction.
Yep.
In there, it says that, Prime Minister of England, Anthony Eden, basically colluded with France and Israel because he wanted to attack Egypt. So he had Israel attack, so then they could come in and quote unquote take over to defend, but they really were setting it up to attack Nasser. I mean, it was like Israel did it in collusion with France and England. Right.
Absolutely. That's the word I use. No question. I mean, most people, until they saw The Crown, it's like 56, the Suez Crisis. Well, what actually was the crisis? And the crisis was that it really marked the end of British and French colonial imperial influence in the Middle East. Right, 48, all of the British Empire kind of ceases to exist. The Cold War is just beginning, and these two former imperial colonial powers have pretty much ruled Asia and Africa for a long time. They're like really angry that the Suez Canal, which was a major source of revenue, a major security control element for them, was being nationalized. They didn't have the wherewithal to deal with it. They were dealing with building up rebuilding their societies after the war. And they said, we'll get Israel involved. Unfortunately for Israel, I think, wasn't able to kind of reap really good, well, I guess this is a term I'm inventing, really good diplomatic brownie points. Not good enough, at least.
Right.
And ultimately, you'll see next week, after 67, there was a huge falling out with France, and France stopped selling weapons to Israel. And only afterwards, it happened a bit earlier, I think, under Johnson in the mid-60s, but only later on under Nixon was Israel, for the first time, really militarily supplied by the United States. So there is truth, there's a lot of truth to what, I saw The Crown, Rabbi, but I remember that whole piece of it. And again, my wife's like 56, like, what's going on? Like, people don't even know, but it was a not insignificant thing.
And I just want to point out one more thing that I saw. Those camps where the Mizrahi, the Yemenites, those horrible tents and camps, they were the refugees kicked out of the Arab countries, and the Palestinians were in similar camps, but Israel absorbed, even though it took a long time, all those people and gave them, I think, homes and integrated them, whereas the refugee camps, this is before the 6-Day War, they kept them there, status quo, and they never absorbed any of those people.
To this day, you're absolutely right. Look, what I was having a conversation with my nephew that is really into Israeli politics about whataboutisms. What about the truth of the matter is, and the way I constructed these 6 sessions is really kind of focusing internally. And there are a number of subjects that I brought up this week, for example, that are very sensitive subjects that we don't often talk about. Civil war, almost, over reparations, over the Altalena, the challenge and the trauma of poor immigration. I'm not blaming the Ashkenazi establishment. There were a lot of wrongs that were committed in that period. But ultimately, you're absolutely right, Rabbi, in that the notion of Ben Gurion, I firmly believe, was recognizing that certain things had to be undertaken in order to ensure the survival of the state, sometimes compromising individual liberties, no question. But all of those immigrants were instantly given citizenship and the right to vote, and supported by, wealthy diaspora Jews and by the taxpayers of the rest of us, no question. And it's a totally different reality for the Palestinian refugees. And I mentioned this, I think, last week. I said that Palestinian nationalism is largely still a nationalism that is based on the trauma of the decision in 47, the Nakba in 1948-49, the refugees who were created. And part of that narrative, ultimately, is continually supported by the fact that the Lebanese government, with all of their crap going on, still does not give citizenship to Palestinians who live in refugee camps, still does not allow Palestinians in Lebanon to be doctors, lawyers, and about 20 other professions. Only in Jordan were they given citizenship, but they're still largely housed, a number of them, in refugee camps that have now been replaced by Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees. But there's no question how Israel dealt with absorbing new immigrants is fundamentally different from how Arab countries dealt with it. And from our point of view, it is about what we say in our prayers. Kibbutz galuyot, me'arbat kenafot haaretz. We believe in the ingathering of exiles. We still believe that Jews from Ethiopia and Jews from the former Soviet Union are mishpocha, bring them home. Are there issues in their absorption? Are there issues in discrimination? Absolutely. But they're citizens of the country. We're the only country in the world, the only Western country, I like to say, who went into the heart of Africa and brought our brothers and sisters home rather than brought them into our land to make them slaves. But it shouldn't gloss over the sins of the failures, I should say, not the sins, the failures of their absorption into Israeli society. But absolutely right, Rabbi, totally different reality.
So there's a question. What was the rationale of the British plan that had the country so split up, pieces in different areas as shown on the map? We're talking about the 48 partition.
47 partition. First, let me try to pull that one up and see if I can get to that map. First of all, it wasn't a British decision. It was the United Nations. The British had been so upset. The British essentially said, what's going on over here? The British said that they had had enough. Please exit the full screen. Thank you. The British had said that they had had enough of the, of the mandate. And so they decided that they were going to go to, that they were going to turn it over to the United Nations. And there, the United Nations decided that they were going to, there we go. The United Nations decided British in Palestine, and their major criterion was population. Who lived where? So if you look at this map, here it is, sorry about that. If you look at this map, you'll see the weird pieces that the decision, sorry, wrong map. There it is. So the light blue again was supposed to be Jewish, and the orange was supposed to be Arab, right? And pink, Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And it's largely to do with who lived where. And ultimately, as I said, this plan wasn't implemented because of the nature of the war and the agreement between Israel and all of the neighboring countries. So essentially had to do with population more than anything. Look, the clearest example is Jaffa. Jaffa, Tel Aviv is a joint municipality today, but back then Tel Aviv was Jewish, Jaffa was Arab, and Jaffa, it's hard to see in the map, but Jaffa was supposed to be part of an Arab state. It made absolutely no sense. The Galilee here, mostly Arab villages. There were some Israeli communities. We saw, remember the Tower and Stockade story last week of 50 plus settlements established. Hanita, remember the picture with Rabin up there with Moshe Dayan, I should say, 1938 established right here on the border of Lebanon. So essentially population. All right, I see more Q&A.
Let me see. There's another one. That was the only one I have. And let me look in the chat. Oh, yes, that Eddie Greenberg says, you can see the conflict between the Mizrahi and Ashkenazi in the Valley of Tears on Showtime, which was during the Yom Kippur War, which I will talk about, I know, in a couple of weeks. I just want to say one more thing. Besides the discrimination against the Mizrahi, there was, and I was there in 1968, and it was still there, just starting to change, a discrimination against Holocaust survivors. There was this terrible arrogance by Sabras against Holocaust survivors, like, oh, we would have never let that happen to us, and they should have fought back. Of course, there were tons of fighting that, you know, we've known since then, but they were quite, and the importance of the Eichmann trial was, even the Israelis, the Jews there, had not heard these stories, did not know what had really happened. So the whole world was listening, but a lot Israelis too. So that was
absolutely. There, I mean, I'm trying to pull up the picture from last week, Rabbi, of where is it here? There it is. We got to go over here. Trying to pick up the let's see, you don't want to see of last week of the new Jew. And keep in mind, from 1862, 1880, 1897, the different waves. This is not for you. Don't worry about that. I'm just trying to pull up the image. From way back when, the idea of the founding fathers and mothers, right, of Israeli society was to create this brand new person who was able to, where is it here? Who was able to, there we go, speak a new language, modern Hebrew, defend the homeland, focus on self-defense, and was also able to work the land. And the very nature, the notion, I should say, of labor, of Hebrew labor, Anu Banu Arza, we've come to the land to build and to be built, was an act of redemption. And this whole idea of this new Jew was something that really was essential to the foundation of the state. Now, keep in mind, the majority of people who are here, here's the slide, the majority of people who were here up until 1948 were these Zionists, Ashkenazim, who came from Eastern Europe. There was a small minority, Mizrahim, yes, and religious Jews who had been here for hundreds of years. But they were essentially religious Jews not living productively off of the land in Jerusalem and Tzfat and Tiberias and Hebron. And all of a sudden the Zionists come along and say, no, we're going to paddle upstream. We're not going to, we no longer believe that God is sovereign, but we, the people, are sovereign. And we're going to create a brand new persona around this holy trinity of Jewish Hebrew labor, language, and self-defense. And here is the Sabra, right? Our children of the Eastern immigrants are going to look and act like this. And all of a sudden, two waves of immigration that are twice the population of the pre-48 Jewish population Palestine come in a decade. Mizrahim, you're different. Why didn't you wake up to Zionism? Hello. Well, things were a little bit different in Muslim countries than in Christian countries.
right.
We were tolerated. It wasn't so bad. Zionism, God will send us when the Messiah comes, more traditional Jews. And Holocaust survivors, as you said, Rabbi, were looked down upon and were not allowed to tell their story, and the horrible nicknames that they were given by their founding fathers and mothers. Why didn't you read the writing on the wall? You should have known. And it took, as you correctly said, Rabbi, until the Eichmann trial, when people finally had the opportunity to publicly hear of the evils that the survivors had actually gone through, till they stopped judging them. There was also a lot of what's the word I'm thinking of jealousy toward many of the survivors who were receiving reparations. So you're living in Israel in a period of austerity. You've been through hell. Nobody wants to hear the hell you've been through because you made the wrong decision. You should have been a Zionist and come here early. Yeah. And you're getting more money, foreign currency, whatever, Deutschmarks, whatever they were, while the rest of the country barely is enough, money to put food on the table. So there's a great book I will tell you by Tom Segev. It's the 7th Million, and it's about the absorption of immigrants from Europe, and it's a really harrowing read. And I think that the story of the Sephardic, the challenges of Sephardic Mizrahi immigration and the Holocaust survivor immigration, again, it's not that the founding generation wanted to, ignore these sins, shall we say, or the evils or the mistakes that they made in the first generation. It's I think Ben Gurion saying essentially, listen, we had to do these things in order to stand on our own 2 feet. And I think now, as Israel is kind of going 180 degrees, as I mentioned that quote, from the first 20, 25 years about the we rather than the me, Israel is much more about the me, but it's struggling to figure out how do we have the me and the we at the same time. Exactly. In other words, how do we celebrate, and you'll see this when I talk later in coming weeks about immigration from Ethiopia and the Soviet Union. How do we allow people? It's fine. Like when I made Aliyah 33 years ago, people said, you can't be Mike. You got to be Micha, Mickey. You got to be Ari Ben Canaan. I'm like, really? No, I don't. I'm Mike. And it's changed a lot. People speak English in their home. People speak Russian in their home. And that wasn't accepted in the early years. Everybody has to be the new Jew. And today there's a lot more legitimacy and respect, I think, for differences within the subgroups within Israeli Jewish society. Definitely.
Thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. And we learned so much. And I, who even know a lot, I learned so much. And we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 9:30. Thank
I
you,
do, and
everyone.
And I thank you, Rabbi, because although it sounds like I know all this stuff, when I put the presentation together, I learned a lot more about it as well as
That
everyone else.
always happens, right?
Thank you for the opportunity. Stay safe. Go Dodgers. We'll see you next week.
Okay, bye, everyone. Thank you.